Hello, welcome back to this video series for Comp 6259 Advanced Games Design at the University of Southampton. My name is Dave Millard and I'm one of the lecturers on the course. In this video we're going to be having a look at emergent narratives. So if you remember, these are narratives where there is no author, but rather the player interacts with the game and perceives stories in the world around them. If we wanted to add more detail to that, we might say that we are dealing with a rich simulation and autonomous characters interacting with one another within that simulation. However you think of it, the key thing about emergent narratives is that you're sacrificing fine-grained authorial control for a kind of greater degree of novelty and responsiveness to player action. So going back to our previous video, what we have is we have increased levels of agency, but now we have to design in a way to try and support that dramatic arc, because otherwise you might not achieve one. It's worth saying that not everyone believes that you need to have a dramatic arc. James Ryan makes a very convincing argument that emergent narratives have an alternative set of aesthetics that they draw on, and that actually you don't need the dramatic arc at all. So for example, they're actual, meaning they really happened. There's a thrill of them being personal. They can be strange and uncanny. There's a sense of discovery, improbability, and a kind of excitement about seeing something which is unlikely. They're vast and ephemeral. There's a enjoyment in the fact that they're unauthored, but also co-authored, that the player is part of producing them and that they're part of a larger context. The argument is that these aesthetics are the things that draw people to emergent narratives, rather than a defined dramatic arc with the classic rising tension and climax. One of the best known examples of emergent narratives is Dwarf Fortress. Now, built by Tarn Adams originally in 2002, it was actually released to the public in 2006 in a sort of open alpha, and it didn't go gold on Steam until 2022. It's a completely procedural generated world, which generates not only the terrain, but also the climate and the history of everything within that space. It's well known for extremely detailed world modelling, sometimes leading to crazy results and stories. Let's take an example story. This one is from dwarffortressstories.com and it was posted by a user called Taran, and it's the story of Bronze Murder. So Bronze Murder was a thriving fortress, population of 66 dwarves, and we can already see some of the aesthetics that Ryan was talking about. So first of all, this is an actual thing. The person has seen this develop over time. That also makes it personal because it's something that's unique to them. And it was uncovered, so they've discovered things along with the dwarves. For example, the existence of this large underground lake at the very bottom of their mineshaft. The dwarves have installed 23 pumps down in the cavern to bring fresh water up to Bronze Murder. Now, the only problem is that a legendary fell beast, Argaz Rashas, has taken home on one of the pumps. And the first pump, the lowest one, needs to be pumped manually. That means a dwarf has to go down and operate it. Here we see some more of those aesthetics, the uncanniness of the fell beast, the improbability that it would just happen to settle on the pump that needs to be operated manually. The dwarves and the player need to decide what to do. A dwarf needs to go down and operate the pump, but if they wake the creature and runs away, then it will draw the fell beast back into Bronze Murder, where it will kill all of the citizens. So the player decides to send the militia. Again, this has more aesthetics that emerge. In particular, we start to see a story that is co-authored. The player is taking responsibility for some of the actions that are happening. So unfortunately, this action triggers a chain of events that were not expected. Situation normal, all fouled up. So in this case, what happens is that the Argaz Rashas destroys the militia, except for one war dog that survives and runs away back up the stairs. Argaz Rasha follows the dog up the stairs, slaughters the beast, discovers a mechanic who runs all the way back up to the main fortress, and the fell beast follows. And the short story is that chaos completely erupts in Bronze Murder. Just at this time, a party of unlucky migrants arrive. They're immediately drafted into a ramshackle militia to fight the beast. They confront the beast, but Argaz Rashas chases them and kills the dwarves at random. Refugees cluster in the barracks outside. Masons are ordered to pave over the entrance stairs to block the creature inside. 2 of the 3 stairways are blocked when it bursts out of the 3rd, killing the masons. The last hope is that the field of traps around the main entrance will kill the creature when it makes it that far. Driven mad with trauma, Dwarves in the barracks begin rioting and attacking each other. Militia starts arresting and beating dwarves. Arghaz Rashas blows past the traps and puts the riot to rest by killing everything. And again, we have an actual event, the improbability of this sequence of things, and this sense that it is unauthored, that nothing is in control, that it's chaotic. Now, although we have around 70 casualties, what with the original inhabitants and the new arrivals, 5 dwarves are still alive, and they've managed to gather themselves in the dining hall. With all the dwarves destroyed, Arghaz Rashas rests at the entrance to the fortress, and the surviving dwarves inside set about trying to set up themselves. They get rid of corpses, you have a donkey and a dog as a food source, and they can access the stairwell and get water. They're not happy, they have no plans, and they're doomed, but they're alive. And Arghaz Rashas waits. Again, this improbability of these 3 dwarves being left after this incredible slaughter. Now, after several months, after all hope has been lost, a human trade caravan arrives. But it turns out that Arghaz Rashas was extremely wounded during its attack on the dwarf fortress, and the humans are experienced warriors and defeat Arghaz Rashas and finally kill the beast. And this is where we bring in the last of the aesthetics, this idea that this dwarf fortress that we're looking at is actually part of a larger context, a vast external world, which is providing us with things like, in this case, these human caravan guards. Now, hearing the creature's death cry, the survivors break down their barricade, but the dwarfs are not in a happy state. One of them commits suicide, and the other 2 carry on. They clean out Bronze Murder, drag out all the corpses, they start bringing people in, sending a message to the outside world that Bronze Murder is alive. And thus ends this story of Bronze Murder, a story that is personal because it happened to a particular player and was co-authored. It was happened as a response to things that they participated in. So what happened then? Because the images I just showed you are not from the game. The text is not from the game. It's an account, a retelling of the story that came out of the simulation. So what is it about the simulation itself that makes these kinds of stories happen? What is the process that's going on? Well, emergent narrative relies on the player as storyteller. Essentially, 3 principles. Anthropomorphism, which is a human being's tendency to see human characteristics in inhuman things. Apophenia, which is our tendency to see causal links and patterns between random events. And narrative sense-making. Again, a psychological tendency we have to tell stories about events, crucially filling in the blanks, assigning motives, and conjuring causality out of nowhere. So when you're designing an emergent narrative game, you're not telling a specific story, but you're rather trying to set up a series of events and a simulation that maximizes these 3 things to enable the player to tell the story themselves. Essentially, the fabula and the story emerge entirely from the player's interactions within the game system. So one way to do that is to make sure that our game has agents with particular goals. That's the anthropomorphism angle. We should have a simulation that produces credible and coherent events. That will enable people to see patterns, apophenia. And it should be a complex system, a game with sufficient mechanics and interactions to produce emergent behaviour, or in narrative terms, a rich fabula that we can then use for narrative sense-making. And if you think back to our narrative design principles, remember that depth is the best form of complexity. There's an excellent GDC talk by Matt Brown from Maxis EA, who worked on The Sims, talking about some of the design principles that they had to enable The Sims to have exactly this kind of emergent narrative space. He talked about the need to allow the specifics of stories to vary, what he calls the snowflake con. So you might have a number of particular stories that occur regularly, but because the specific people who are involved are different, because they have different characteristics, the player perceives them as being different stories. He talks about the importance of ambiguity, leaving the player room to assume, to see things. And a really good example of that is Simlish, which is the fake language that the Sims speak. Because they're not speaking an actual language, the player is free to interpret what the Sims are saying and fit that into whatever story they happen to be perceiving. Matt also talks about the importance of using randomness to create possibility space and using suggestive control, so leaving room for the Sims to be autonomous in some respect. Crucially, he talks about being inspired by the yes and rule from improv. So if you're not familiar with it, this is the idea that in improvisation, you should riff off what somebody else does. So somebody else begins a scene and you accept what they've said, that's the yes, and then you build on that, that's the and. So his argument is that the automata, the game, should build on the player's choices. It looks at what they've done, the yes, and then it builds on that and does something extra. So for example, The Sims has this idea of story trees, which are the ways in which characters might progress. But initiating a tree and progressing along that tree is left entirely up to the player. He talks about the need to create multiple paths to success, and also the idea of perturbing the strategic landscape, which is a fancy way of saying that once you have a simulation, you need to inject events into it for characters to respond to. That, by the way, is very similar to Todorov's idea of equilibrium and disruption. A game that does this really effectively is Frostpunk from 2018. So Frostpunk is a kind of a management sim, a survival sim, where you build and maintain a city during a kind of worldwide volcanic winter in a sort of steampunk area. You must mine for minerals and grow your city. You must maintain your generator, and you have to survive the terrible weather. Now, as you progress through the game will actually generate events or event arcs based on the status of your city. In other words, it looks at how you're doing, the yes, and then it suggests an event to build on that. So for example, if you're running low on food, you'll get food riots. If your healthcare is not very good, you'll get healthcare protests, etc. It also has a separate set of events in a kind of a 3-act structure, which is based on you take different scenarios, and that's the yes bit. So here the game suggests something that happens. So there's a crisis in the coal mine, there's a giant storm, and the player needs to respond. Another example of a game that uses events really successfully would be RimWorld from the same year. In RimWorld, you take control of stranded colonists in a kind of a far-flung planetary system. Your job is to develop and grow your colony and try to deal with the internal and external dangers, and ultimately to find a ship to escape. And again, the game generates different events, so raids, sieges, animal attacks, infestations, etc. But what it does is that it allows you to select a particular storyteller, and that choice of storyteller is a way of controlling difficulty. It's also an example of anthropomorphizing a whole system within the game. So for example, Cassandra Classic provides a kind of fairly well balanced approach where you do get serious events, but they're paced out, enables you to develop and build and prepare. Phoebe Chillax is kind of easy mode, so fewer events, longer time between them. And Randy Random is essentially a much more random configuration of events where you may be hit by multiple large events all at once, and it produces a much more chaotic gameplay experience. So in conclusion, we can see that emergent narrative games rely on sense-making, anthropomorphism, and apophenia. And that means that you must design for those things. You create the space for people to see their own narratives in the events and the things that happen within the simulation. It's also possible to take a step back and to say that actually in an emergent narrative, you don't necessarily need a dramatic arc. The narrative itself has its own set of aesthetics, its own set of rewards for a player, and that, in some cases, might be enough. In the next video, we're going to move on to procedural narratives. If emergent narratives are bottom-up, procedural narratives are top-down. They look at what's going on and they try to impose a story to build a dramatic arc. So, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.